Ani Bojo, Benezi Dishnakas, Wajash Dodam Anishinaabe, Angwaro Dodam Haudenosaunee, Oliver Donji Ba North Bay and Dayan, Anishinaabe and Dow. Maurice Switzer is the name on my driver's license. I do a lot of, I guess, what would be termed public education work with a focus on the treaty relationship between First Peoples and newcomers to Canada. I do a lot of writing, and I also represent a First Nations and Indigenous perspective in my role as a commissioner with the Ontario Human Rights Commission. One of the reasons that I do the work that I do is to try to create more understanding among not just non-Indigenous peoples in Canada, but also among Indigenous peoples about the treaty relationship, and not just from a historic perspective, but on the contemporary implications of that relationship. And it's significant that that the current Prime Minister of Canada just on February 14th of this year just admitted in the House of Commons that the treaty rights that are enshrined in Canada's Constitution have not been implemented. I think the education that has taken place on treaties in different places in the country, in the formal education setting, for example, has tended to look at treaties from purely and simple a part of Canada's history as something that is no longer valid or applicable, and so I don't know whether I'd refer to anything I do as an example of excellence, but I think it's a focus that is not as common as I've seen in other treaty education programs. Well, there's certainly an element of discussing the history of it, but I use wampum belts, and not a lot of people do or have made a study of that, and that provides an understanding of the treaty relationship that I don't think exists among a lot of people. And there are the significance about those belts is both spiritual, it's contractual, it's moral, it's ethical. And the meaning that those belts carry also has a relationship to, I guess, what we call land-based education, because the beads from which those belts are made talk about the relationship with the water and how important that is, and not just a relationship between humans, but between humans and the earth that we walk on, and that the treaty relationship was seen as a way to enhance the relationship between humans, but also to protect the environment that the humans are using. In most cases, people of all ages have a fascination for the wampum belts. They're something tangible, people can touch them, it's not just words on a page, the words which are usually very old and archaic, English, for example. And when we discuss how the belts were made, for example, the painstaking way that they said a couple of hundred years ago it could take a woman 2 days to craft one bead from a quahog shell, which is only found in one place in the world, off the eastern coast of Turtle Island, North America. And when people learn things like these shells are now recognized by modern science as being perhaps the oldest living creatures, the quahog, they have found them 500 years old, so that speaks to the special meaning they had for the people who wove them into the belts, that those agreements were supposed to last forever. When people can actually handle an agreement as opposed to just read about it, I've noticed that it even from people at the highest levels, even political people, judges. I was at a session in Toronto a week ago, and Justice Tony Mandaman was asking me questions about the belts that he hadn't learned about in schools in all his education. So yeah, that seems to be a way that people feel that the belts have a more special personal meaning than, again, just words. It's important that people know the true history of their country, and a lot of that, unfortunately, the relationship with Indigenous peoples, as First Peoples, has not always been pleasant, and in Canada's 150-year history as a confederated state, those 150 years have been among the worst 150 years in the millennia that Indigenous peoples have been here. And that, we can talk about the Indian Act and residential schools and missing and murdered women and epidemics of preventable diseases and lack of potable water. But the relationship wasn't always like that. The relationship started on a more positive note. Part of the reason for that positive note may be that the Indigenous peoples outnumbered the settlers, but it was not always envisaged as as the relationship that has existed, and I think that when people, particularly younger people, have an understanding of how Canada really started, it gives them a different perspective on the kind of country that they think Canada can be. Not one in which there are some people who can't enjoy the benefits and privileges that many Canadians do. Again, safe drinking water, safety as a woman to walk down the streets. So I think particularly the younger generation who are learning about these things, learning in a way in which they don't feel guilty about the past, but learn from it. I think that has an impact that I think is going to make for better informed citizens, and citizens who have perhaps a greater sense of social justice. When I first worked in a First Nation environment, it was at a post-secondary institute called First Nations Technical Institute on Tyendinaga Mohawk territory, which was my great-grandmother's home community. And I had to do a lot of learning when I was there, and it was drilled into me by my colleagues that in a classroom learning environment, and indeed probably in any learning environment, it should not be hierarchical. It should be considered that everybody in the process is a learner. And again, the mainstream type of education is often, unfortunately, one in which someone at the head of a classroom jams information into students as if they were some sort of empty vessel. And actually, the way I was educated as a teacher or a public educator by my colleagues was that the best way to learn is to have discussions. Some people liken it to the Socratic method of ancient Greece, where everybody, some might lead the discussion, but everybody participates in it. And the answering of questions is far more important than preaching something at someone. And to me, that's the hallmark of what we would call Indigenous learning. I don't even like the word education, learning. So that everybody in the process is a learner. There isn't a teacher and a student, that everybody in the process is a learner. And to me, that's, if you ask me what Indigenous education means, that's what I'd say, a process in which everybody learns from one another. Well, terminology is such a moving target, and I know that the first program of its kind in Canada, Trent University, when it started 50 years ago, it was called Indian and Eskimo Studies. It has evolved from that into Native Studies. I don't know whether they ever used the word Aboriginal, but today they're Indigenous studies. And Indigenous is a very scholarly word, but I think the important thing is we have to have titles on formal education programs, so people who are interested in pursuing them know what they're about. So I guess from that perspective, Indigenous is useful. But when we talk about the different First Peoples, I think the most important thing is to call people by the name that they call themselves in their language. For example, there are Ganyegahaga people, Mohawk people, there are Anishinaabe people. Some people say Ojibwe, but that's just one small subset of the Anishinaabe nation. Some people say Cree people, but they call themselves Mushkegowuk or Nyana, I think out Nyani, out west. The whole issue of terminology, I'm sure it's very baffling for people who are not Indigenous, but Indigenous, of course, means original, first, and I think that's the most important aspect of it. So when we talk about an Indigenous education program, we're talking about a program where people can learn more about the First Peoples who are in a place, and in our case we're talking about the First Peoples who are in what's now called Canada. I think the physical place where the learning takes place is really important, and even in classrooms which are not always comfortable, I think how we sit. I know in the course I taught at the University of Sudbury, I should have been persistent in having the room arranged so that learners sat in a circle. I wasn't aware that was doable until too late in the game, but that's the most, in my experience, that encourages the most interactivity among groups, whether they're adults or students or learners of all ages. So that's a big part of it, is that way of learning. The other thing is getting away from the classroom environment as often as possible. It's not always easy, and depending on weather, but being outside is a really important way to learn. I know that mainstream education is now becoming fascinated with land-based learning. When we think about it, it's not a new thing. Our ancestors, whatever ancestry we have, learned everything they needed to learn outside thousands of years ago. So it's not a new concept. So I think that's important. And I've been taught by the people I've learned from, the Anishinaabe teachers that I've been lucky enough to have, and some Haudenosaunee teachers, that even the idea of standing up in front of people or being putting yourself on a higher level than them, it sends a message about, again, a hierarchical approach, that some people are more knowledgeable or learned or important than other people. And even to the extent that I've been taught that when someone is smudging, for example, that I notice many people have the habit of standing up, which I've been taught is a very Christian thing to do, and that we're supposed to stay as close to the ground as possible. So those are things that I don't think in most educational environments people give much thought to, but they send a very strong message to everybody in the group. The other thing, it's important that everybody in the group gets a chance to say something. And sometimes the way to do that is to start with a talking circle at the start, for example, of a school year or of a meeting or of a conference. I was at a conference in Toronto recently, and the organizers they were all mainly Indigenous people, or they were certainly all Indigenous issues. They were mainly Indigenous people in the room. And the organizers started with a typical agenda. At this time, we're going to do this. At this time, we're going to do that. And many of the Indigenous people, particularly the elders, thought, I've been invited to this event and nobody's giving me a chance to talk. So they started talking. And it was a bit confusing for a while to the organizers, but they learned an important lesson that if you invite people into your circle to learn, everybody has to have the opportunity to say something. I spend most of my time now going into the public school system classrooms in the North Bay region with the Near North District School Board. I do some presentations for both the local community college and university. More and more, I'm being asked to work at professional development days with teachers of school boards, a lot of them in Southern Ontario. And from what I've learned from teachers and students, I think what needs to happen in education, if we can use that word, across the country, is that education is not just about presenting facts and information to people. It should be about providing people with information that helps them develop a sense of values. And I know that in Western society, a lot of time has been spent with the so-called separation of church and state, to the extent that we are graduating people from our public school systems that don't appear to have had any serious discussion during their formal education years about values, about principles, about ethics, about what's involved in being a good citizen. And those things all involve an awareness and some commitment to human rights, the rights of all people of all peoples in the world to live in dignity. I believe all peoples have inherent rights to manage their own affairs. We are in a world that includes a lot of what we would call colonized states, and you can see those states in many parts of the world now starting to come apart at the seams, because I believe that when people have had their own identity, their own language, their own cultures, you could only repress or suppress that for so long. We're even seeing in certainly not a third world part of the globe, but we're even seeing in the British Isles, we're seeing peoples like the Scottish people saying, we want to have our own parliament. We want to, we've been suppressed. We don't feel like we're British. We've seen that, of course, in Ireland. We've seen it in the breakup of supposed nations like Yugoslavia, where it's split apart at the seams. We've seen the breakup of the Soviet Union, and we've seen it in Canada. We've seen people in the province of Quebec saying they don't feel they feel more part of their own culture than of what Canada has become. And the people who've been suppressed the longest have been the First Peoples. And so I believe that our education system, our formal education system, public education work, learning about our society in general, should involve more awareness about the types of societies that have existed here. We had very civilized, in the true sense of the word, cultures here, years and years and decades and centuries before people brought Western modes of governance and things to this part of the world. And I think the more that people who are learning about their society understand those values, those teachings, I believe the better that the current, the contemporary societies will be. And so I think my vision is based on that type of I guess what we would call cross-cultural awareness, or in some places they're teaching things like comparative religions. We live in a world where, for example, the last census in Canada shows that almost half of the 36 million people that live in Canada are multiracial. So to keep operating systems of government, justice, education that are based on very narrow European, Eurocentric values, that's not going to succeed for too much longer, I don't think. And I think people are starting to understand that. My work with the Human Rights Commission in Ontario has helped me understand that for many people, the very concept of human rights is foreign. When they think of human rights, they might think about freedom of speech, or something obvious like that. But I don't think, even though our country's population is changing drastically, I don't think most Canadians, particularly of earlier generations, I don't think most of them that I meet understand the challenges that are faced by people of different cultural backgrounds in this country. I know they don't, and I can see it on social media constantly. And I think we have, again, people of a certain generation, not the generations that are coming, but maybe of their parents and grandparents. And I hear this from teachers, that they don't get pushback when in their classrooms they're discussing Indigenous history and sad things like residential schools and that. They don't get pushback from the students as much as they hear about pushback from the parents who feel guilty about this. It bothers Canadians to think that this sort of thing could have happened in their society. And the truth can be uncomfortable. So I think on the local and the national level, I think educators and leaders in all walks of life have to do maybe a more concerted effort than we've all made in the past about helping people understand that our differences have made Canada the country that it can be. And we're much different than our neighbors to the south, where they tend to want everybody to be the same. And you can see how that's working out as those different cultural populations expand. You can see the challenges that's posing. So I think that awareness that we are as different as we might be, we have many things in common that can make Canada better. I think that's an important thing that people need to stress.